What inspires an award-winning author, gardener, and carpenter? Let's find out. Hi, my name is Crystal Fletcher, and welcome to All About Books. If you love books, then you've come to the right channel because I interview the person behind the novel and find out what inspired them to write it. Today, I am thrilled to have Nina Newington with me, and we are going to chat about her latest novel, Cardinal Divide, which was published by Guernica Editions. And just to give you a little taste about what her novel is about, I'll read the back jacket. A father comes out to his daughter as a woman, or at least he was once a woman. It's complicated, funny, painful, eventually joyful. Meanwhile, the daughter, who was adopted, has her own identity issues. At the Indigenous Addiction Treatment Center where she works, everyone assumes she's Cree. But is she? How can she find out? Her need to know leads her down dangerous roads. Cardinal Divide is full of voices rarely heard in fiction. It explores the hunger for certainty and the mutability of identity, whether of gender, race, or sexuality. Nina, welcome to All About Books.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm just thrilled that you're here. So I'll just jump in and ask you some questions here, Nina. When did you know that you wanted to be a writer?
I think I was about 14. When I was a child, when I was younger, I wanted to be a marine biologist. I think because of Jacques Cousteau. But when I was about 14, I started, well, I think I'd always read a lot, but I started going and living my life in books because my life at home wasn't great. And I think that really fueled the desire to be a writer. And, you know, I tried, but I found once I got to university, it was a much more competitive world, and that writing part of me kind of went into hiding. And I ended up going to the US as a graduate student and sort of thought I was going to go back and do a PhD and do all this stuff. And then this little wise voice, which didn't have a lot of sound in my life at that time, but this little wise voice said, "What do you really want to do?" And I thought, well, I really want to write fiction. And I realized that I was going to be an academic because I was too afraid to do the thing I really wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And that was actually a lousy basis for a life. So I ditched the very lucrative scholarship I was on and went and lived in New York City and became a carpenter because I wanted to have a way to support my writing without being totally impoverished. Mm-hmm. And I took writing workshops with a wonderful woman called Gloria Ansaldúa, who was a sort of Chicana lesbian mystic who did these amazing workshops, and stories just started coming out of me. And I really had very little memory of my childhood up to about the age of 11 or 12. And suddenly these stories came out, and I felt as if I had just discovered a whole other room inside me that was full of life and stories, and I really just wanted to connect with that and let it come out. And that, in a funny way, at that point I was drinking a lot, and the drinking began to get in the way of the writing, and it also began to get in the way of an awful lot of other stuff, as sometimes happens. But I think that I got sober in order to do something I loved as much as I did to save my life from all the bad things that were happening. Mm-hmm. And it really was about stories and the coming of stories. And then I got sober by listening to other people tell their stories, and began to find the stories that were really hidden in that forgetting, and for many of us that involves a kind of history of abuse, and for many people who are sober, that's true. Mm-hmm. But I've been sober for 36 years now.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. And I've been writing for all of that time, and it's a really amazing life to get to do that.
It is, and just so incredible that stories saved your life. So thank you for sharing that. And And congratulations. Um, Now, specifically, Nina, what inspired you to write Cardinal Divide?
This was actually one of the most wonderful writing experiences of my life. My first novel came out and we had just immigrated to Canada. It was about 5 months after we arrived, and the press, I was unable to go back to where I had been to the US to launch the book because I'd been banned from the US for 10 years, which is another story.
Yeah.
But the press had organized a book launch in Vancouver at the public library. So Alexa, my wife, and I drove over there and did the book launch, and she had to come back because she had kind of a serious job. So I drove back by myself, and coming down the Coquihalla Highway, suddenly the story of this book just started to spool out in my mind. It just arrived and it kept telling itself, and I was driving along going, whoa. So I went into Kamloops and I ran into the pharmacy and I bought a notebook and I just sat in the truck and wrote until there wasn't anything left to write. And that really was the core of this story. Most of the characters, much of what happens, I mean, things change a lot in the course of rewriting, but the core of it just came as a total gift.
That's
It was an amazing
incredible.
experience.
Yeah. I love it when the creative energies cooperate. So you were born in Hong Kong, lived in Nigeria, and you had mentioned that difficulties in the US led to immigration to Canada. So you've spoken about your book growing from experience of this immigration to Canada. In particular, Edmonton is of importance to you. So how so?
Well, Edmonton was the first place we came to in Canada because my wife had a job there. And I ended up working at an addictions treatment center just outside the city, mostly created by Indigenous people and mostly for Indigenous people, but not exclusively. But very shortly, before I started working there, but very shortly after arriving in Edmonton, I was really quite startled because white person after white person would tell me stories about drunken Indians. And almost in the same breath, they would say, we're not racist in Canada. And, you know, it was like, okay, so, huh?
Yeah.
And I think, you know, it's a very interesting thing to come into a country with very little knowledge, as people often don't have a lot of knowledge about Canada, but very open to learning and wanting to learn about Canadian history and literature and politics and what was happening. It was very good for me that I very quickly made friends with a whole range of Canadians, including a bunch of Indigenous people, and I was working in a mostly Indigenous setting. So I got to really see how different Canadian history looks from different eyes. And I knew that already in the sense that, you know, I'm a woman, history looks different when, you know, from a feminist point of view. I'm queer, it looks different from this point of view than straight. So there were a lot of different lenses. And I think I've always just been really interested in what now there's a phrase that comes from a Mi'kmaq elder about two-eyed seeing. And for the Mi'kmaq, in relation to science, that would be combining traditional knowledge and some of kind of modern, more Western science base and coming up with a much deeper understanding. But I think in a general way, I want two-eyed seeing. I want to try and see from different directions. And writing is a tool for imagining. You know, it's not that I know, and this is an interesting thing when you're trying to write characters who are not you. And I wouldn't be interested in only writing characters who are me. In fact, this book is probably the least autobiographical of anything I've written. But the other thing that happened very early on was that I began to meet a bunch of people, including one of the couple who moved our possessions from Massachusetts to Alberta, who were only just discovering their Indigenous heritage and who didn't know, and also people who just weren't sure where they came from. And so I found myself really interested in a character who didn't know, just as I didn't know. and who was trying to imagine herself into the different possibilities and not claiming to know, but having a desire to know, and more than just trying to know with your mind, but trying to imagine with your heart. So there's a character who doesn't know where she came from and is trying to work out if she's Indigenous, and is following some clues, and begins to really face what happened to Indigenous families in the, throughout the history in Canada, but particularly in this book in the 60s Scoop, when children were being basically just taken off the reserves and put up for adoption. It really changes her to imagine that might have been her, whether or not it was her. And I think the other thing is I'm very interested in uncertainty.
Yeah.
It's kind of tricky because you write a book that poses these mysteries and these questions, and is it going to feel like a cheat if people get to the end of the book and you haven't given them the answers? But on the other hand, how do you write a book about uncertainty and stay true to that? That you don't want to pretend that all of life is tied up with nice bows and that you always can have the answers. So the book is really in many ways an exploration of that. And I wasn't, of course, expecting that we would all be in the world's biggest sudden experience of uncertainty, and that the book would, be launched on September 1st, 2020, the pandemic. But I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting to have that framework suddenly and be going, wow, yeah, there are a lot of things that you just can't know for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you live with that? How do you work with it?
Mm-hmm. And another thing, Nina, I loved, your voice. Your book is full of voices that are rarely heard in fiction. And when I was reading, I came to the section that speaks about the traditional Indigenous concepts of gender and sexual orientation. And it stopped me in my tracks because I thought it was so beautiful and accepting. And I actually said to Sean, I said, you've got to hear the way the Indigenous people frame this thinking. And for you as a writer, can you explain to our listeners what these Indigenous concepts are and how it impacted you when you were writing your novel?
I can try a bit. I mean, it's not my traditional, yes, my knowledge, but I learned some of this because I was actually at some point hired by the Alberta Native Friendship Centre to write some guides. And one of them was a little research paper into a little bit of history for Two-Spirit youth. Mm-hmm. And I did an interview with a wonderful man called Richard Jenkins, who's a Cree man who's been really working to collect and bring together some of the traditional Cree understandings. And then also I talked to other people, but he did give me permission to share the information that he gave me, and I double checked when I wrote the book. Well, it's important
yes,
to respect traditional knowledge. So what really was kind of amazing to me was that instead of a really binary, you're a man or a woman, there was a sense that how you might identify yourself into a gender, whether you perceived yourself as a man or a woman, would be a primary thing, that nobody was going to go, well, no, you're not that. Mm-hmm. But that there was a kind of, as with so much of Indigenous tradition, a circle rather than a binary opposition.
Yeah. And
that sense of a circle where you really were moving around between, heterosexuality and gender identity, and then maybe you would be, more in the direction of perceiving yourself as being masculine, but you weren't totally claiming that. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's really, I think that's probably the best thing to say about it. But there were wonderful stories that I encountered of the kind of history that was in the language about this. That some of the words for someone who we might refer to as a gay man were, you know, somebody who brings happiness and helps a lot.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but
Yeah.
but the notion that your role might be your part in the whole,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and that everybody by their existence belongs in the whole, that you don't, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you exist, therefore you are a part of it, therefore you are natural, therefore you are not disposable or bad, or, you know, it's
Yeah.
such a different and accepting version. Um,
Yeah, I thought it was incredible. Like it really is beautiful, and so unfortunate that with colonialization we try and, you know, wipe out all of these beautiful ways that are different. So I really enjoyed hearing that in your novel. And
by
also,
the way, sorry.
no,
No, I
no,
was just
no,
going to
go.
say, I think the missionaries had no language. When they came and encountered this really sophisticated version of gender, they were just like, huh? And they really didn't have the tools to think it, because our version is actually much cruder.
So you make a living with your hands. You know, you're designing gardens, you're building things. So you're very connected to the world through your hands. And I was really appreciative of Meg, like just the way her bread making process, and it just, I just really felt that connection throughout your novel. Was this connection, you know, the world through your hands, was it intentional, or is it the beauty of who you are coming through your characters?
I think, honestly, when Meg arrived in my mind on that drive through the Rockies, she was already baking bread. So who's to argue with the, you know, with the muse?
That's right. Well, I really enjoyed that part, Nina. I was wondering if you could read an excerpt from your novel. And before you start, if you could just let us know why you've chosen this particular section.
And I should do a little tiny bit of fill in, because
Sure.
it's I don't keep it a secret, as you've said from the book cover, what the kind of big reveal of the book is, that the father tells his adoptive daughter that he was born a woman. And I was looking for a 3-minute piece that I thought would be fun to read. And, you know,
Yeah.
I experiment with different bits. I had a nice bread making bit, but it took too long. So, but this is just actually one of my favorite parts of the book. And I love Ben, the father's voice. I love Ben, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I like all the characters, but I love Ben because he has this knack for happiness. Like, he could have had this really desperately tortured life, because actually a lot of things were really quite difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But he really has, from an early experience with the kind of effects of the First World War, he has this knack for accepting what is, and accepting what's in himself, and letting things be. Mm-hmm. And it allows him to handle stuff that comes. And I think maybe that's a big part of dealing with uncertainty.
Yeah.
You know, and after all, he lived a life in which, you know, if he got into a car crash and was taken to the hospital, suddenly it would be revealed that, you know, the rancher down the road was not a man. So there was always a possibility that his life might blow up. Mm-hmm. But he has this ability to live with that uncertainty by accepting the things that are. And I love him. So I wanted a piece that had some of his voice in it too. So should I start?
Perfect.
Go ahead, Dad says, when I've poured us both tea. Ask whatever you need to ask. Really. He looks drained, sad. Why don't you start at the beginning with you and Mum, your version? He looks surprised, relieved too. We take a sip, He takes a sip, then puts the mug down. As you know, she was the cook in the lumber camp where I worked one season, up near Revelstoke. A younger, prettier cook than usual, according to the fellows. A smile tugs at the corners of his mouth. They all flirted with her, but I could see she liked me. A couple of them teased me for being so modest. She let them know she personally preferred men with some decorum. She knew the whole time? He nods. How did you find out that she knew? Did she say something? He picks up his mug, but he doesn't drink from it, just looks at me over the rim. There was a spot in the woods where I'd go to bathe, a little spring lined with rocks, traces of an old cabin, spruce and pine all around. It was a good mile from the camp. She must have followed me. She stepped into the clearing. At least I was still dressed. She walked up to me, and where a person would stop, say something, she kept walking. She pressed herself against me, and she kissed me on the mouth. I stepped back, sharpish, kept on backing up. She looked at me, those shrewd eyes. She looked at me. I remember it to this day, the drone of flies in the clearing, moss that grew on the stones around the spring, light angling down between the trees. She looked at me and she said, I know what you are, and I know what you are not. He puts down his mug, reaches for the pot, glances at me. I shake my head. He tops up his mug and adds milk before saying, it was the moment I dreaded, and there it was in the clearing with us, her knowing and me with nothing to say, just the memory of that kiss in my mouth. She said, come here. It was simple. It was so simple. All I had to do was to step through the angled shafts of light, step to her and hold her. But you have to understand, I hadn't touched another human being, not that way, not ever. I stood there in the clearing, and then, I swear it, my feet began to move of their own accord. I watched as they carried me across the clearing and into her arms. She smelled of gravy and cabbage and wood smoke. Nothing in this world ever smelled better.
Thank you for that. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
So before your book, I have to admit, I didn't know that there was actually a physical location, a physical place called the Cardinal Divide. And so it's located in the foothills of BC. Mm-hmm. Why was it important for you to incorporate the actual physical location in your book as well?
It's actually located in Alberta.
Alberta. Oh, excuse me.
Yep. I really actually hated living in Edmonton because I'm not a city person. Yeah. And so as much as I could, I would get out and get to the mountains. And I discovered the Cardinal Divide as, as this real place. And it's called the Divide because it divides the watersheds of the rivers. So on one side, on the west side, the rivers all flow to the Arctic Ocean. And on the east side, they all end up flowing to the Atlantic via James Bay. So I kind of loved the idea of this place that was a divide, but it was also something called a nunatak. And a nunatak is basically a hump or some kind of rise that stayed above the glaciers, that stayed above the ice, and therefore was kind of a refuge where various life forms survived above the ice. I should also say that, as it turned out, Cardinal Divide as a physical place was and is hideously threatened by coal mining. But the sense of a nunatak, and actually the book was called Nunatak in my mind for a long time, and then I finally realized that Cardinal Divide was a better name. The ranch that Ben lives on and that Meg goes to visit, where also there are other characters who don't necessarily fit into the rest of the world so well. Mm-hmm. My mind was exactly a nunatak. It was a place where you might survive and things might endure the grinding of the ice floes. And also in the Indigenous stories, there's a character who talks about how people tried to hide their children when they were being taken to the residential schools and some of the other things that happened, but also how people maybe ended up hiding their traditions to keep them safe. Mm-hmm. And now we're bringing them back out into the open. And so the idea of refuges, of places where you might keep things safe, I think those also exist inside us. And actually, I had never realized this till just exactly this moment, but that's what books were for me. The books
Yeah.
were my Nunatucks. I would go and just live inside a book. And honestly, from the age of 14 to 18, I read a book a day. And they were kind of weighty books. I read my way through Russian literature, and I basically just needed to be inside that alternate world for a while. And to this day, I don't feel quite right if I don't have usually a couple of books on the go, one a nonfiction and one a fiction. And that ability to just go away from your own life for a moment and go hang out in another story.
Yeah.
It's a lovely refuge.
Yeah. Yeah. And Nina, what are you working on right now?
Well, I should say I don't really write until the winter time, because my living has been made designing gardens and doing in the last 25 years, which has the great feature, if you live somewhere coldish, that the whole business shuts down for about 4.5 or 5 months in the winter, and that's when I get to write. But I do have a new novel going, which is set in Nova Scotia and has a woman in her early 60s who's retired there, who used to be an international criminal court lawyer involved with dealing with genocide. I mean, some, really heavy duty stuff. And things have gone on in her own life that lead her to just want to get away. And she comes and, chooses a remote bit of Nova Scotia, and ends up befriending the gardener she hires to help her. Not me, but who is a sort of 7th generation Nova Scotian. And so there's really the relationship that evolves between them. I'm quite interested in the people who have stayed somewhere and the people who have moved around a lot, and the different perspectives and understandings that they bring, and how that rootedness or unrootedness work. Because I think the world is full of both of those things, but many more unrooted at this point. And then there's a sort of, there's a maybe it's a dead body of a kind of Trumpian con man who I wrote before Trump came in, but it's been sort of pretty difficult to resist the parallel.
Yeah.
So we'll see. It's a couple of years into it. I have another memoir I have a memoir that I was working on simultaneously with Cardinal Divide about living illegally in the US for 20 some years, and things began to suddenly fall apart and heat up, and our decision to apply to immigrate to Canada, where we actually had civil rights and were recognized as a married couple, But that's, as they say, another story.
Well, you've got a few stories going on there, and I look forward to reading all of them. And I'm so glad that you decided to immigrate to Canada, because I think we're very lucky to have you. And also a great big thank you for being interviewed today on All About Books. I am so appreciative of your time. And what I'll do below for everyone else, in the description, I will put links to Nina's website so you can learn more about her, and also purchase a copy of her incredible book, Cardinal Divide. So thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you next week.